How have colonial experiences impacted modern African economies?
So the colonial experience in Africa affected its post-independence path in at least three ways. First, Europeans established so-called extractive colonial institutions. First of all, they ruled through local chiefs. Second, they used forced labor. Third, there were direct incidents of genocide or oppression. Fourth, they taxed farming and they pursued agricultural policies that were detrimental to Africa's post-independence path. The second main interventions of Europeans was with building schools and clinics, although most of it was outsourced to Christian missions that implemented those human capital and education policies. The evidence we have is that there has been some local effects of those initial investments, although still we need much more research to understand how exactly those early interventions matter. Third, Europeans did some railroads and some roads, but compared to what was initially planned, there were very limited investments in infrastructure. The evidence points out that although in many cases those initial investments, those initial roads and railroads were abandoned because of conflict or lack of maintenance, still they shaped Africa's post-independence path because economic activity got concentrated in proximity to railroads and roads networks.
How has the slave trade affected social norms?
Research shows that those Africans that come from ethnic groups that were affected relatively the most during the slave trades tend to trust less others. And there is also evidence of family structural differences between ethnicities that are affected a lot by the slave trades and not. For example, there is very interesting research pointing out that polygyny is much more widely practiced in those areas that were affected by the slave trades, most likely because the initial change in the sex ratio, where you had much more men, much more female as compared to male, because the slave traders were targeted strong men, affected family structure. It affected polygyny, which in turn affected human capital investments in post-independence Africa.
What is the relationship between ethnic group partitioning and conflict?
So during the 1875 to 1905 period, Europeans in capitals in Europe, in Berlin, in Brussels, in Paris, and in London, partitioned the largely unexplored continent at the time into protectorate, free trade areas, and colonies. During that time, nobody could foresee African independence, but because of a historical accident, those colonial borders endured African independence. So today, a large portion of Africans come from groups that have been systematically partitioned by the national border. A good example are Somali clans that are split between contemporary Ethiopia, the Ogaden region, the northern province of Kenya, Italian and British Somaliland, as well as Djibouti that used to be French Somaliland. In joint work with Stelios Michalopoulos at Brown University, published at the American Economic Review in 2016, we find that a sizable portion of African conflict that tends to take place close to the borders is mostly concentrated on the homelands of those groups that were systematically partitioned in the 1880, 1890, 1900 when Africa was split. And we provide further evidence that those groups that were systematically partitioned are much more likely to face repression from the state and be involved in civil wars that practitioners identify as having an explicit ethnic dimension.